Every human being who has ever lived has experienced it, yet no one has ever truly returned to describe it. The final moments before death represent the last frontier of human experience, a threshold between consciousness and the void that science is only now beginning to illuminate. What happens inside your body and brain in those last precious seconds of life? What does your DNA do? What signals fire across your neurons? And in that final instant before everything goes dark, is there something extraordinary happening that we have completely misunderstood? The answers are more astonishing than you could possibly imagine. For centuries, death was treated as a single event, a moment when the heart stops and life simply ceases. But modern science has revealed something profoundly different. Death is not a moment. It is a journey, a cascade of biological processes that unfold across milliseconds and seconds, involving billions of cells, trillions of molecules, and the most ancient code in your body, the DNA, that has survived for over 3 billion years of evolution. What happens when that code encounters its greatest challenge? When the machinery it has built begins to fail? The story, science, is uncovering challenges everything we thought we knew about what it means to die. In 2015, researchers at the University of Washington made a discovery that would change our understanding of death forever. Coordinated waves of energy swept across their cortex with patterns unlike anything seen during normal wakefulness or even deep sleep. It was as if the dying brain was experiencing something profound, a final conscious event. But here's where it gets stranger. This surge of activity happened after the heart had stopped, after blood flow to the brain had ceased, after, by all conventional measures, consciousness should have been utterly impossible. Scientists still cannot fully explain this phenomenon. But what they are discovering is that the human body has built-in survival, mechanisms that activate precisely when you need them most. These are not new systems. They are not modern adaptations. They are ancient, hardwired into your DNA by millions of years of evolution. Protocols written in the language of genes, activated by molecules that your cells have been waiting to use since the moment you were born. When oxygen begins to deplete in your final moments, your cells do not simply give up. They execute an emergency program that has been waiting in your genetic code this entire time. The moment your blood oxygen drops below a critical threshold, a gene called HIF1 alpha springs to life. This is not a random response. This is a calculated survival strategy encoded in your DNA billions of years ago. HIF1 alpha rushes through your cells, activating hundreds of other genes simultaneously. Genes that tell your cells to switch from aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen, to anaerobic respiration, which does not. Your cells are literally rewriting their own survival strategy in real time. But this comes at a cost. Anaerobic respiration is brutally inefficient. It produces far less energy, and it floods your cells with lactic acid as a toxic byproduct. This acid accumulates rapidly. It burns, and your cells know exactly what is happening to them. As lactic acid rises and ATP, the cellular currency of energy, becomes desperately scarce, another ancient system activates. Calcium floods into your cells uncontrollably. This calcium influx triggers the release of enzymes that begin to break down the very structures that hold your cells together. This process is called programmed cell death, or apoptosis. And here is something remarkable. Your cells have essentially evolved to commit suicide in an orderly fashion, rather than allow damage to spread to neighboring cells. This is a form of cellular nobility written into your genetic code. But in the chaos of your final moments, this orderly process becomes anything but orderly. The cascade spirals outward. Cell after cell recognizes the signs of death and begins to activate its own self-destruct sequence. Your brain, being the most metabolically active organ in your body, suffers first. It consumes about 20% of your body's oxygen despite being only 2% of your weight. When oxygen vanishes, the brain's energy production collapses almost instantly. The proteins that normally transport ions across the membrane of every neuron begin to fail. Potassium leaks out of your neurons. Sodium floods in, the electrical gradient that allows neurons to fire. The very electricity that creates your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self, begins to disintegrate. And yet, this is when something extraordinary happens. Before the brain goes silent, it speaks. The dying brain enters a state that researchers have only recently begun to understand. The neurons fire in synchronized patterns. Waves of activity ripple across the entire brain's surface in coordinated sequences. Some scientists believe this synchronization represents a final moment of intense consciousness. Others suggest it might be a glimpse of memory, the brain rapidly cycling through its oldest, most fundamental circuits. Still others wonder if it might be something else entirely, something we lack the vocabulary to describe because no living person has experienced it and returned to tell us. The heart, meanwhile, has its own story to tell in these final seconds. Long before the brain realizes it is dying, the heart begins to execute genetic instructions for its own demise. Calcium overload triggers the release of cytochrome C from the mitochondria, the power plants of the cell. Cytochrome C is like a final distress signal. It initiates apoptosis in the heart's cells. But here is something that cardiac researchers have found fascinating. The heart seems to die intelligently. Different regions of the heart shut down in sequence. The electrical conduction system, the ancient wiring that keeps your heartbeat synchronized, fails first. This is why electrical chaos, or fibrillation, often precedes total cardiac death. The heart is essentially trying to reboot itself, firing chaotically in one last attempt to restore coordination before finally giving up. Free radicals attack everything they encounter, tearing through cell membranes and DNA with indiscriminate violence. The damage cascades outward. Tissue after tissue recognizes the signals of catastrophe. The body is literally dissolving itself from the inside. Your immune system, even in these final seconds, tries desperately to maintain order. White blood cells detect the damage signals and begin rushing toward dying tissue. They attempt to contain the spread of cellular debris. They try to prevent harmful molecules from leaking into the bloodstream. But they are fighting a losing battle. The sheer volume of damage exceeds their capacity to respond. The immune system, which has protected you your entire life, recognizes that it has met an enemy it cannot defeat. In the brain, something else is happening that science is only beginning to map. As neurons lose the ability to maintain their electrical gradients, they begin to release a neurotransmitter called glutamate into the spaces between cells. Glutamate is crucial for normal brain function. It is how neurons communicate. But in the absence of proper energy regulation, glutamate accumulates to toxic levels. It overstimulates the remaining functional neurons, flooding them with calcium in a process called excitotoxicity. This is, in essence, your neurons being electrocuted by your own brain chemistry. Yet in this process, something unexpected may occur. The cascade of glutamate and calcium release might trigger the activation of regions of the brain that normally fire during intense dreams or during deep meditation. Some researchers have speculated that this might explain reports from cardiac arrest survivors. The DNA itself continues to unwind its own story even as the body dies. Some genes activate, others remarkably go silent. Epigenetic switches, molecular tags attached to DNA that determine which genes are turned on and off, begin to shift. Genes that have been silent your entire life might suddenly activate. Genes that have been active for decades might shut down. Researchers have found that in dying tissue, there's a wave of genetic activity that seems almost purposeful. It is as if your DNA is attempting one final scramble for survival, activating genes for heat shock proteins that might protect against damage, genes for autophagy that might clear out damaged components, genes for apoptosis that might trigger an orderly shutdown rather than chaotic destruction. Your genome is still fighting. It has not yet surrendered. The skin dies next. The cells in the outer layers, which depend on constant nutrient delivery from blood, cannot survive more than minutes without oxygen. They begin to turn a grayish color as hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen and gives blood its red color, changes chemical form when no longer bound to oxygen. This color change, called livor mortis, is one of the first visible signs that the body has begun to die. It is, quite literally, your cells dying in real time. The cooling of the skin that follows, algor mortis, occurs because your body no longer generates heat. The metabolic fires that have burned in your cells since the moment you were born have extinguished. In your gut, something remarkable occurs. Your intestinal bacteria, which have lived in symbiosis with you your entire life, begin to sense that their host is dying. Some studies suggest that bacteria detect the absence of the immune signals that normally keep them in check. Without these signals, they begin to spread, they multiply, they begin to migrate across the intestinal barrier that is rapidly deteriorating. This is the beginning of putrefaction, the process by which bacteria consume your tissues and generate gases and odors. But this process, while seeming gruesome, is actually the final chapter of your body's story. Your cells, your tissues, are being recycled. The elements that composed you are being broken down and returned to the world. The carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other elements that were organized into the complex structures of your body are being released back into the environment. In a sense, you return to the cycle of life immediately. The mitochondrial DNA, the ancient DNA that lives inside the mitochondria and that we inherited exclusively from our mothers, degrades more slowly than nuclear DNA. This is because mitochondrial DNA is more compact, more densely packed with genes, and wrapped in protective proteins. It persists even as everything else falls apart. Some ancient, the most fundamental, the DNA that has been passed down through an unbroken chain of mothers for hundreds of thousands of years. It is as if your most ancient heritage, the DNA that links you directly to humans, who lived before civilization, before agriculture, before writing, holds on the longest, hypothesis is that certain genes are held in check by the living body's defenses, and when those defenses fail, these genes are released and can finally activate. Another hypothesis is that some genes encode for proteins that are only useful in the context of death and decomposition. The genes that cause your tissues to break down, death is not a binary switch. It is not an instant when everything stops. It is a gradient, a slow dimming of function that cascades from system to system, from tissue to tissue, from cell to cell. Some parts of you die immediately, others cling to life for hours or days. And on the molecular level, individual cells are still alive, still metabolizing, still responding, even after days have passed. This has profound implications for what we think death is. In the traditional sense, death is when your brain stops functioning irreversibly. But in the modern sense, with our ability to resuscitate people who have been clinically dead for minutes or even hours, death becomes much more ambiguous. There is a spectrum, a twilight zone between life and death where the brain is gone but the body persists, where consciousness has vanished but metabolism continues. The ancient DNA that has organized you has been interrupted but not fully erased. The same carbon and nitrogen and oxygen might be organized by new DNA into new forms of life. Death, when we finally understand it, is not an ending. It is a transition, a transformation as profound as the moment your individual DNA first organized into a single cell. A moment when the complexity you have becomes simplifies, when the coherence you have maintained falls away, when the pattern that is you dissolves back into patterns. Your final moments are not the moment your consciousness winks out and nothing continues. They are the moment when the most exquisite complexity in the known universe, the living human body, transforms into something simpler, something that obeys different laws, something that returns to the world. Forms, old forms dying, the cycle continuing endlessly. Death is not a failure of the system, it is an essential part of it. Death makes room for new life. Every body that falls decays into nutrients that feed new growth. Every organism that ceases to exist passes its atoms and, in some cases, its genes to the next generation. Your death, if and when it comes, will not be the end of the story. It will be another chapter in a narrative that has been unfolding for billions of years. A narrative written in DNA. A narrative that you are part of. A narrative that will continue long after you are gone. And in that continuation, in that endless transformation and evolution, a part of you will endure. Not as a person, not as a consciousness, but as energy, as matter, as the eternal cycle of life, death, and new life that has always defined existence on Earth.